Hi kids, welcome back. It's story time with Kurt Thompson and Music History 101. We're going through all the interesting composers and people that make up part of our music history, and we've made our way through a good portion of the Baroque period, but we're at one of the big heavyweights right now, and you know who that is. Who is that? Who? Yeah, his name starts with a B? Yeah, so you're reading my mind. Just about everybody in the Bach family was a good musician, but nobody was better at it than Johann Sebastian. If you wanted to, you could trace the Bach family back through 5 generations. Wow. But you still wouldn't find anybody to beat J.S. Various members of the Bach clan were organists, townpipers, and instrumentalists in Thuringia, a small state in the eastern part of what is now Germany. As far as being musicians, the Bachs had Thuringia pretty much sewn up. Johann Sebastian's great-great-grandfather, Old Bach, was a miller. He liked to play his lute while the millstones ground flour in the background. J.S. later said it probably helped him to keep time. Okay. Johann Sebastian's father, Johann Ambrosius, married Elizabeth Lambertschirt, whose family were prosperous furriers and part-time mystics. Mystics? What? Okay. Johann Ambrosius had a twin brother named Johann Christoph. They looked so much alike that not even their wives could tell them apart. Uh-oh, I have a feeling I know where this is going. Johann Ambrosius, or someone who looked just like him, and Elizabeth had 3 sons, Johann Christoph, Johann Jakob, and Johann Sebastian. In the Bach family, you weren't anybody unless you were named Johann. So, that's interesting. In other words, Bach's father and Bach's uncle were almost identical. Pretty interesting there. Johann Sebastian was born on March 21st, 1685, and was baptized 2 days later at the little church of St. George in Eisenach. At last report, the church still stands, and the present pastor still refers to that historic event whenever he baptizes a new little baby in the same font. Maybe he figures it will give them something to work towards. At age 8, little Sebastian was sent off to school, where he did considerably better than his brother Johann Jakob. He was a good singer and was one of those pupils who always knows the answers to everything. Probably no one else liked him very much either. His mother died when he was 9 and his father a year later, so Sebastian was shipped off to the little town of Ohrdruf to live with his brother Johann Christoph, who was an organist and a pupil of Johann Pachelbel, the one who wrote the famous canon. Okay, so we'll keep moving on here. Since money was scarce, it was soon decided to send little Sebastian to the choir school of St. Michael in Lunenburg. The rule stated that the singer had to be the offspring of poor people with nothing to live on but processing good voices. He seemed to qualify on all accounts, so off he went. The school paid for his tuition, room and board, and gave him candles and firewood. When his voice broke, we are told Sebastian sang and spoke in octaves for a week. It must have been an interesting effect, but it didn't last. Anyway, Sebastian was kept busy after playing violin, viola, and organ. One of the ways Bach learned about music was to copy the compositions of his predecessors. He did a lot of this while at school. Nowadays, we would call this plagiarism, but back then it must have been okay. Since photocopiers had not been invented yet, he had to do this by hand. Historian Cecil Gray says, he absorbed all styles instead of being absorbed by them. Karl Geiringer says something similar. Young Sebastian absorbed all instruction as readily as a sponge does water. For a while, Bach studied organ in Lunenburg with George Bohm, who had been a pupil of a man named J.A. Reinken. Bach walked 30 miles to Hamburg to hear Reinken play. Yikes. Okay. Continuing, after arriving in Hamburg, Bach was hungry and tired from his long walk, but he had no money for a meal. As he tells the story, he was just sitting outside an inn, minding his own business, thinking about food and rubbing his tired feet, when out from an open window were tossed 2 herring heads. And as if that weren't enough, each fish head contained a Danish ducat. Now you tell one. Whatever that means. Having studied hard and soaked up everything, it was time for Bach to get a real job and start kicking butt. His first position was as organist and choirmaster at the little church of St. Bonifacius in Arnstadt. The choir members, all boys, weren't very good singers and were very rowdy. The young Bach had trouble keeping them in line. His bullish temper didn't help matters. He once got in a street brawl with one of his choristers, a boy named Geiersbach, who called Bach a dirty dog. Well, a little later, Bach asked permission from his employers to travel to Lübeck to hear the great Danish organist Dietrich Buxtehude. Now, I remember Buxtehude. They weren't terribly keen on the idea, but they gave him 4 weeks off anyway. Bach set out, again on foot. It was more than 200 miles, but he made it somehow. Man, he's seriously in great shape to be able to do that. Bach had a wonderful time in Lübeck and was thrilled to bits by Buxtehude's playing. Since Buxtehude was thinking of retiring, he offered his job to Bach, who was only 20 years old. The only catch was that Bach had to marry Buxtehude's daughter, Anna Margareta, who was nearly 30. This seemed perfectly reasonable to Buxtehude, since he had done exactly the same thing to get the job from his predecessor, Franz Tunder. Bach, however, was not so thrilled with the offer. He said thanks, but no thanks. 2 other great musicians at the time, Johann Sebastian and Georg Friedrich Handel, also turned down the offer of the job to complete with his wife. It wasn't the sort of fringe benefits they had in mind. Okay, it says here, I know you're dying to know who did the job actually go to then. And the daughter. It eventually went to a man named Johann Christian Schieferdecker. He didn't amount to much. Okay. What with one thing and another, Bach spent 4 months in Lübeck. When he got back to Arnstadt, the church authorities were a bit angry, to put it mildly. Furthermore, Bach had come back with all sorts of fancy ideas about playing hymn tunes with lots of extra notes and ornamentation. This annoyed the congregation, since they had trouble finding the melody. Okay. They told him to cut it out and keep things simple, so he did. Too simple. Bach wasn't keen on Buxtehude's daughter because he'd had his eye on someone closer to home. Very close to home, in fact. Her name was Maria Barbara Bach, and she was a second cousin on his father's side. She was an orphan living with her aunt and uncle in a little house called the Golden Crown. Bach lived there for a while too, and that's how they met. It was convenient anyway. She was cute as a button and had a lovely soprano voice. Pretty soon the church authorities noticed that the 2 of them were spending a lot of time alone together up in the organ loft. They were only practicing their music, but that sort of thing makes church people nervous. So all things considered, Bach decided it might be a good idea to move somewhere else. He and Maria Barbara got married and moved to Mühlhausen and a new church job. Bach's salary in Mühlhausen was 85 gulden a year and 3 measures of corn, 2 trusses of wood, 1 of beech, 1 of oak or aspen, and 6 trusses of faggots, delivered at his door in lieu of arable. Let's see what. Okay. When the young couple were married, they were helped along financially by an inheritance from Tobias Lambertschirt, Bach's uncle on his mother's side. 14 years later, in 1721, when Maria Barbara had died and Bach was about to be married again, he got an inheritance from the widow of Tobias Lambertschirt. Things didn't work out very well in Mühlhausen. The church authorities were a sour-faced old bunch who didn't believe in having any fun. Within a year, Bach had accepted a job as court organist to Wilhelm Ernst, his ducal and serene highness of Saxe-Weimar. The Duke offered Bach double his previous salary, and Bach said, "When do I begin?" Bach's letter of resignation to the authorities at Mulhausen starts like this: Your Magnificence, honored and noble sirs, honored and learned sirs, honored and wise sirs, most gracious patrons and gentlemen. It gets worse. So maybe he didn't want to leave anybody out. The Duke was a kind man, if somewhat stern. Everybody had to turn out all the lights by 8 p.m., 9 p.m. in the summer, and the Duke had a habit of asking the servants at random about the subject of the chaplain's sermons. He wanted to make sure they'd been awake. The Duke liked music, and the organ at Weimar was a good one. But the first thing Bach did was to install a set of chimes. Then it was even better. All the years of practice, not to mention the walking tours, had made Bach into a terrific organist. Once when playing a concert at the Royal Court of Kassel, he played an elaborate pedal solo so well that the Crown Prince took a ring off his finger and presented it to Bach. As one observer put it, if the skill of his feet alone earned him such a gift, what might the prince have given him had he used his hands as well? Wow, this is a long one about Bach. We continue on. But through it all, Bach remained the same humble man he'd always been. When someone complimented on his playing, he once said, "There's nothing to it. You have only to hit the right notes at the right time and the instrument plays itself." That's easy for him to say. Historian Dr. Charles Burney tells us that Bach sometimes used a stick in his mouth to hit a key he couldn't reach with either hand. That's bizarre. About this time, Bach became friends with Johann Gottfried Walther, an organist and lexicographer. What the heck is that? Lexicographer, they were cousins. Walter was a Lammerschert on his mother's side. Okay. He also won a public clavier playing contest against the great French keyboardist Louis Marchand, who failed to show up. On the day of the contest, Marchand suddenly remembered he had important business out of town. You know how it is. Bach spent nearly 10 years at Weimar, but then found it was time to move on. The old Duke was having a family quarrel with his nephew, and Bach was sort of caught in the middle. So he accepted a job at the court of Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen. Bach didn't leave on the best of terms. He spent nearly a month in jail for too obstinately requesting his dismissal. Whoa! Bach went to jail for a month? Let me say that again. Okay, so the guy that was paying him salary, the Duke, was having this quarrel with his nephew, and somehow Bach got in the middle of it. Probably the Duke wanted him to take sides, and so without giving knowledge to the Duke, he accepted a job at the court of Prince Leopold, and probably didn't give enough notice to the Duke, and so the Duke had him arrested. He spent a month in jail. Wow. While he was under arrest, he composed 40... What? Dude is composing while he's in jail? While he was under arrest, he composed 46 chorale preludes, so the time wasn't completely wasted. What kind of jail was that? The Weimar Council snubbed him later, too. When they came to publish a list of court organists over the years, they left Bach completely out. They must have been pissed that he left them. Okay, at Köthen, however that's pronounced, I'm not a German, nor have I studied German language. Bach had a 17-piece orchestra. He had a big band. Pretty cool. Which kept him busily composing. The court bookbinders finally had to ask him to slow down so they could catch up. He composed little instruction books for his son Wilhelm Friedemann. The boy, we are told, was very bright, just like his dad. Historians know this because he used to doodle a lot on his school books. Maybe he was just bored. If you wanted to, you could think of Bach's Children by Maria Barbara as his second cousins once removed, but that's probably not a good idea. Bach tried out for an organist job at the Jakobkirche in Hamburg, and although he dazzled the judges with his playing, they wouldn't give him the job unless he made a hefty donation to the church. Bach refused, and the job went to a second-rate organist named Johann Joachim Heitmann, who just happened to have a spare 4,000 marks in his pockets. Later, Bach composed a set of 6 concertos that he sent as a gift to Christian Ludwig, the Margrave of Brandenburg. Bach copied out the score very neatly, tied it up with a nice ribbon, and sent it off to him. The Margrave thanked him very much, but probably had never opened the package. He didn't have an orchestra, so it didn't do him much good to have the music. Well, it's the thought that counts. After Maria Barbara died, Bach married again, this time to Anna Magdalena Wulkan, who at 20 was 16 years younger than he was. She was a very good singer and a good copyist besides. After a while of copying Bach's manuscripts, her handwriting began to look like his. Maybe she wrote some of his music, who knows? Bach's patron, Prince Leopold, got married at about this same time too, but he didn't do as well. His new wife was his cousin, the Princess of Anhalt-Bernburg, and she thought music was a waste of time. She liked to do needlework, but it's not the same somehow. So, in 1723, Bach and his new wife packed up all their possessions and the kiddies. There were 7 by this time, 4 boys and 3 girls, and they moved to Leipzig, where Bach was appointed cantor and music director of Thomas Schule. Bach's possessions included 6 claviers, a lute, and several other instruments, a variety of candlesticks, 2 silver coffee pots, 1 large, 1 small, a silver teapot, and assorted pieces of furniture. He also had 3 different coats. The silk one was somewhat worn, he says, and 11 linen shirts at the wash. He probably picked them up before he left town. At the St. Thomas School, Bach was expected to teach the boys music, Latin, and grammar, while leading a sober and secluded life. He hired a man named Petzold to teach his Latin classes for him. Bach was busy at Leipzig when not disciplining small boys. He found the time to compose nearly 300 cantatas. Yikes. Read that again. Bach was busy at Leipzig when not disciplining small boys. He found the time to compose nearly 300 cantatas, the B minor Mass, and his mighty St. Matthew Passion. Wow. I don't know how these guys are doing that back then. It's amazing. Okay, what does it say here? We can argue about the St. John Passion too, if you'd like. In his spare moments, he composed other things. His old temper hadn't left him. When the university officials turned down Bach's application to compose a special piece of music and gave the job instead to a man named Görner, Bach tossed his wig at him and said he would have made a better cobbler. Bach's salary at the school was 7 thaler a year, with extra money to lead the choir for funerals. Bach complained in a letter to his friend Erdmann that people in Leipzig just weren't dying fast enough for him to make a decent living. The school's old rector died and was replaced by Johann August Ernesty. He was one of those progressive types who didn't care much for music. He used to call the boys in the school orchestra pothouse fiddlers, which was bad for morale. Bach spent more and more time traveling around the country trying to out new organs, and as an excuse to get away. In his last years, Bach was nearly blind and his health was declining. It was all he could do to jot down the first 239 bars of the last fugue of the Art of Fugue, the most amazingly complicated fugal composition ever written. An English oculist, John Taylor, attempted surgery on Bach's eyes, but it did no good. The operation left him completely blind. Suddenly, on July 18, 1750, Bach's eyesight was miraculously restored, but he suffered a stroke and died 10 days later. Anna Magdalena never remarried and tried to struggle along on a measly pension. She died a bag lady in the streets of Leipzig. Wilhelm Friedemann did pretty well as a composer and recitalist. One source tells us that he had a beautiful shaped long-fingered hand. Carl Philipp Emanuel worked for Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, and Frederick liked to play flute but took liberties with the tempo. CPE just played along and said nothing. After all, Frederick was the king. Johann Christian moved to London and wrote operas. There were other Bachs, but none of them amounted to much. Bach's grandson, Johann Sebastian II, was a painter, but you can't get ahead that way. By the May of 1871, historian Sanford Terry says Bach's blood had ceased to flow in mortal veins. Okay, kind of a long one about Bach. And they didn't say much about a duel, but I remember hearing, I guess he had a duel with one of these kids where he stayed. Actually, they didn't. I've also known that Bach, actually, this is kind of weird too. If you can imagine, Bach lived where he worked, and he also lived in the dorm where these kids were. And so he had his own private quarters, of course, but on the other side of the wall were all these kids making noise. And anyway, I heard that he had a duel with one of the kids. I don't remember the outcome of it, but there's a lot of other interesting things about Bach. He had a ton of kids as well, so that you might want to Google him. I want to say that he might have had as many as 20 kids or more. And so, anyway, you can check more out about Johann Sebastian Bach. And for people out there that are not musicians or have gone to music school, the one melody and song that you've heard before around Halloween, in case you didn't know it was Bach, is the Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. That's the one that starts off. Ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, bom, 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 bom. You heard around Halloween and some of the scary movies, and you probably didn't know that was the guy that we just got done talking about, Johann Sebastian Bach. So kids, you're probably fast asleep. This was a long one, and when you get up in the morning, don't forget to put a nice like here on this video. It was a good one for putting you to sleep. Until next time, this has been Story Time with Kurt Thompson and Music History 101.